Welcome to Gideons Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
Happy Freedom Day, everybody. James, Heather. Yes, thank you for joining me on Freedom Day.
Happy Juneteenth.
Yes. And although this episode won't be aired for a couple of weeks, I do want to acknowledge that we're recording this as we celebrate Juneteenth and acknowledge the ongoing struggle to realize the unfulfilled promise of freedom for Black Americans made on this day back in 1965. I can't think of three people I'd rather be hanging out with having this conversation. And given that public defenders are so centered in this struggle, it's really fitting that we're having this discussion today. So, for the listening audience, I have three people with me who are truly doing transformative work in the criminal legal arena. I also count all three of them among my closest friends. We were all young public defenders together with the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia in the 1990s and early 2000s. Heather, you were like 16 at the time, right? While me, James, and David were probably pushing 30. And we've all gone on to continue our criminal justice work, sort of having been deeply shaped by that experience as public defenders. And I want to make sure we're talking about that today. But first, I want to introduce y'all a little bit. So I'm going to start with you, James Forman, who, as I said, was a public defender in the District of Columbia when I started back in 1995. Soon thereafter, he founded the Maya Angelou School in Washington, D.C. He was a public defender when he founded it. He co-founded it. And it really started as a school to provide education and support to public defender clients and court-involved children, and has really expanded to now be a school that serves largely, James, is it correct, Black and brown communities?
That's right. 99.9%.
Yeah. And I also want to note, James is now a professor at Yale Law School and the author of Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. It is a Pulitzer Prize-winning must-read about race and criminal justice in America. And I wonder, James, before I move on to the next guest, could you just share for a minute what led you to write that book?
Oh, wow. Well, let me just say up front, it's just such an honor to be in this conversation with the three of y'all and on this day. And one thing I just want to acknowledge about Juneteenth, one of the many travesties of slavery has been the way in which Black Americans have been disconnected from our ancestors. I know my father is Black and my mother is white, and I know that one of the great sadnesses in my family and my father's family is that we cannot trace our family back until any earlier than about 1900. And so when I see these pictures of these freed slaves gathering to celebrate emancipation and Juneteenth, I think about the fact that one of them could be my ancestors, and even though I don't know who is, I just want to take a moment to honor them and honor their struggle, and just respect that. In terms of your question, I think that a big part of my motivation came from the fact that we were all working together in DC in a majority Black community and with majority Black overwhelmingly African American clients, but also a lot of African Americans in positions of power and authority. You know, a majority Black police department, many Black judges in Superior Court, not that many Black prosecutors, and that was and still remains a problem. But other than that, you could walk into a courtroom and see mostly Black people. And the system that had been created and that was being in some way run by Black people was the same system that's churning up Black bodies all across America. And that was a frustration. We used to talk a lot about the PDS. You know, we come back from court, but Black lawyers, all the lawyers, and sometimes we would just be like, man, I can't believe that judge did that. And we'd be talking about a judge that was a Black judge. And so I really felt like I wanted to try to write a history and tell a story of how it was that Black communities wrestled with over punishment, over policing, under policing, mass incarceration, victimization. Like how did that story, you know, how did that play out? And fundamentally, why was it, to ask the question maybe in the hardest way possible, you know, why was it that when we as public defenders were advocating for our clients, we sometimes faced not just white authority figures, but Black authority figures who were arguing for the opposite? And that's a question that has consumed me since my days with y'all in Superior Court, Washington, D.C., and it's why I wanted to try to tell that story.
Yeah, good. Well, it's a must read. It's a must read. The second guest I want to introduce, and James, thank you for the heartfelt sentiments about Juneteenth. I really appreciate that. Second guest, David Singleton. And in addition to serving as a public defender in Washington, D.C., where David and I met, he started as a public defender in Harlem. He then went to Ohio. He's now the executive director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, where he leads the charge to both provide direct services to people and to advocate for policy reform. And David, one of my favorite initiatives of OJPC is an initiative called Beyond Guilt, where you fight for the freedom of people who, while not innocent, have been over-punished. And I wonder if I could ask you to maybe share a few words about what Beyond Guilt is and why you felt compelled to launch that initiative.
Well, first of all, Rap, thanks for having me. The four of you, or the three of you that I'm talking to, I look up to so much, and it's just an honor to be part of this conversation, particularly on Juneteenth. We started Beyond Guilt because it really grew out, frankly, out of an experience I had representing an innocent woman who was wrongfully convicted. And I spent 5 years working really hard to free Tyra Patterson, who you know well. She's very much part of the Gideons Promise family. She's now my colleague at OJPC. A wonderful person, some of the best work I've ever done in my life. But I felt after walking her out of prison on Christmas morning 2017, I felt a disconnect in a certain sense to my upbringing as a public defender, my professional upbringing. Because the work I did with you and with HP and with James and with the folks in Harlem, it wasn't about innocence. It was about fighting for the humanity, frankly, of poor people who had the government stepping on their necks all the time. And I wanted to figure out a way to get more back to my roots as a public defender, and that is representing people irrespective of guilt or innocence. So we started Beyond Guilt in April of 2019. The point of it is to represent people who admit their guilt, who've been in a long time and have been overpunished, and who can demonstrate rehabilitation. We've freed close to 20 people so far, including folks who have been convicted of murder, and we've found creative ways to get the court vested with jurisdiction again so it could help undo the wrong, and we've been partnering with prosecutors to make this happen. And I'm as excited as I've ever been as a lawyer, and hope to be to continue this work for a long, long, long time.
Man, I just love it because I think something we all know that is sometimes lost on many people when they think about justice reform is that the cruelty and the injustice of the system is about more than wrongful convictions. It really is about how we target certain communities, over prosecute, over punish, over criminalize. I love that Beyond Guilt is really addressing that aspect. So thank you for that, David. And last but certainly
you.
not, yeah, last and certainly not least, Heather Pinckney, who we all refer to as HP. So if I slip into calling Heather HP, you all know who I'm talking about. I actually knew Heather when she was a law student working at PDS while we were all young lawyers, and she, from there, became one of the leaders of the DC Public Defender Service before leaving to start a law firm with another fierce public defender and dear friend, Brandy Harden. The two of them started the law firm of Harden and Pinckney and really never left their public defender roots. Harden and Pinckney continue to handle predominantly court-appointed criminal cases. She's also one of the most sought after and dynamic public defender trainers nationally. She's a respected member of the faculty of the National Criminal Defense College, and she is the co-founder, along with another PDS alumni, April Frazier Camara, of the Black Public Defender Association, such an important organization. And HP, I wonder if you could share a little bit about what the Black Public Defender Association is and why you have invested so much in that.
Sure. So just like everyone else said, I'm beyond grateful to be with you all. You all really are my heroes, and I really use many of your writings and everything in my classes. So I'm appreciative to even be in this space with you. And I think it was knowing you all that helped us form BPDA. So we started BPDA because in addition to loving being public defenders, we noticed that within the communities of public defenders, there was not a huge group of recognized sort of skilled national Black public defenders. And we wanted to support people in becoming PDs, staying PDs, getting into leadership positions in these offices. And though we sort of all walked the walk of being PDs with many of our colleagues, we recognize that being a Black public defender, when the clients often look like you, when they're from your neighborhoods, when they are often family members of people who you are very still tight with and love, that's a different walk that many of our colleagues don't have those same connections to, and wanting to support people through that. So BPDA has been amazing in sort of allowing us a safe space to have those conversations and nurture and inspire Black public defenders to maintain in this work and really encourage others to join us.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful organization. I have to say, the work you do with BPDA, David, the work you're doing along with Tyra, James, your writings and the work you do, all of that has really, I think, informed our approach at Gideon's Promise and shaped the organization. So I thank you all for that, and I think it's sort of it's not surprising that you all have had such influence on our work at Gideon's Promise because I know that your work as public defenders largely shapes the work you continue to do, and you see your work really connected to that. And I think people are going to see that as we talk for the next 45 minutes or so. But I also wanted to mention that, as we enter the fourth week now of uprisings, protests, rallies, demonstrations nationally in the wake of the killings of Rashard Brooks and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. I've been thinking a lot about public defenders and the critical role that they play in this larger fight for racial justice. And when I do, I actually go back to my first year as a public defender, James, and I think about something you said to me that really helped reorient how I see the work. As young public defenders, there were a group of us that met regularly to just talk about why we did this work, what inspired us to do this work. And there were people who did this work because they wanted to fight the government and the power of the government, and people who did it because they cared about the communities impacted by criminal justice. But you said you did this work because you wanted to do civil rights work. And when you said that at the time, I didn't really get it. I thought of civil rights work as freedom riders and people who registered folks to vote in Mississippi. I didn't see public defense as civil rights work. And now I can't imagine public defense without thinking of it that way. And a lot of that came from you. And I wonder if you'd share with the audience what led you to say you wanted to do civil rights work, and that's why you became a public defender. What did that mean to you?
Well, I'd be curious too to hear what Heather and David have to say, because I don't know that my perspective on this is so unique as a Black attorney, but most Black stories travel across generations, and that's especially true in the Black community. When you're part of a community where the history books have sometimes excluded you, then there's a tradition where people pass stories along. And a story that my father used to tell me often was about when he was a graduate student in the 1950s at USC, and he was in the library studying, and he came out of the library, and police officers were outside, and they pulled up and they said that he fit a description of a robbery that had taken place. And my dad said, I just walked out of the library. I've been there for hours. And as it happened, I was sitting next to in plain view of the library staff. So if you come back in with me, they'll tell you that I've been in there. I didn't do any robbery. The police took him, ignored that simple, basic act, not just of decency, but of police work. And they instead took him down to the precinct, where they interrogated him. They beat him and held him incommunicado for over 24 hours. And for my dad, that's part of why those incidents, that's part of why he became a civil rights worker, because he didn't want to live in a world where police could do that wantonly, without accountability, without remorse to a Black citizen. And so what my dad was doing was immediately connecting for me the relationship between police brutality and civil rights. So when I'm graduating law school now, 30 years after that, and I'm seeing Rodney King being beaten by the same police department that beat my dad, and then I'm seeing him being acquitted, the officers who beat him being acquitted by a jury in Simi Valley. And I'm seeing all this at a time when mass incarceration is, although that term didn't exist yet in the early 90s, the features of the United States becoming the largest prison system in the world, had already happened. So all those things are happening in front of me. So to me, I felt like, well, if you want to fight the civil rights struggle, if I want to fight the civil rights struggle, then the place that I need to be is representing people who are charged with crimes, representing people who are being abused by the police. So for me, it just seemed so obvious. And I remember that conversation too, because I loved you then like I love you now, but I saw the incomprehension in your eyes, and I had my own incomprehension in response, because I was like, how is this not everybody's motivation? And so we grew a lot together through that conversation and many others. But I don't know if David and Heather have similar stories, but I imagine they might.
Yeah, David and Heather, chime in. I want to hear what your reaction is to my question.
I'll tell you that I when James was speaking about it, it's like, okay, it's good to know I'm not kind of crazy by myself, because I felt so much of that, not so much in hearing my dad's story about the 60s, but I grew up in Southeast DC, and so I would see people get arrested and beat up by the police, And then my neighborhood would kind of panic, and they would say, like, how do we afford a lawyer? And unless we can get someone from the public defender service, like, we're screwed. And I was like, these are people who work every day, who I know are not the richest people, but they pay their tax. Like, why does it have to be that because we're from this particular neighborhood, we don't get the same type of things that I thought, should have been extended to everybody? And so it made me start to have conversations about, if I wonder if this was the same thing that people during the civil rights movement and saying, was like, we want to be equal with everyone. And so for me, becoming a public defender was a great way to sort of equalize all the anger, the frustration, and say that if you're going to come for my people, you're going to have to come through me. And it was so the best place, of course, that, but it was a good mix of me to kind of deal with all that passion. But that's who PDs are. We are sort of like these freedom fighters in the front and taking these blows oftentimes for our clients because we know that they are systematically sort of oppressed and beaten down all the time. So I definitely feel James on that.
Yeah. David, how about you?
I feel James too. And I feel HP too. But I came to the realization that this work is the civil rights work that must be done much later in my professional life. I think had I been in that conversation, and I joined PDS the year after you did, Rap, I might have looked at James with the same look of, why is he saying this is civil rights work? Because my path to PD work came out of an experience that I had when I was a junior in college, and I spent the summer in New York City. I happened to have been born on a tough block in the South Bronx, but I grew up in a very different place, Asheville, North Carolina. And when I went back to the South Bronx that afternoon, I asked my mom to tell me, what street that I lived on when I was born. And I found it, and I was blown away with how different that community looked. My community, that would have been my community, looked compared to where I grew up. And I think at that point, seeing young Black and brown men having to deal, I remember an arrest that happened that afternoon when I was up there, having to deal with that, I wondered, could that have been me? So my motivation to be a public defender was to fight for people who could have been me, and I wasn't looking at it through the civil rights lens as much. I think that why I look at it is a civil rights issue. In addition to all of the things that both James and HP said, is because of how contact with the criminal legal system destroys Black and brown people's lives. I do so much work now on trying to undo the damage of a criminal conviction that limits the ability of people to find a job, that limits the ability of people to go to school, that restricts folks from housing opportunities. You don't get to live a free life. You don't. I mean, I'm not saying everybody who's got a criminal record is feeling like they're incarcerated, but many do. Many who are walking around without chains on are nonetheless chained by having a criminal record. And when you think about how Black and brown communities are over-policed, we've got an area of Cincinnati where rich white kids use drugs all the time. And, if they have any police contact, they are taken back to their families. They are not put through the juvenile system or put through the adult criminal system. And if you are in the west end of Cincinnati, which is, a predominantly Black community in the urban center, you're not going to get those same breaks, and you're going to get, most likely unless you have a fierce public defender fighting for you, you are going to wind up branded for the rest of your life in a way that will make it difficult to just live. So for all the other, in addition to the reasons that James and Heather said that this work is civil rights work, that's why I also feel it is as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I certainly am aware that in the 25 years since I met James and the 2 decades since I met David and Heather, I've grown a lot as a lawyer, as a person. Without many, many teachers in my life, I wouldn't have the perspective I have today. Gideon's Promise wouldn't exist. You three are certainly among those teachers. And I frequently now say, right, despite my reaction, James, to that evening 25 years ago, I now say, and I stole this from you, that public defenders are doing the most critical civil rights work in the criminal legal system today. And I have to say, when I go around talking to reformers and funders, and I try to help them understand that public defenders are critical to any larger vision of addressing racial oppression. Oftentimes they don't get it, and public defenders are left out of the conversation. So I wonder if you all could share some thoughts about sort of your own views. How does the work of public defenders fit into the struggle that gives rise to the uprisings that we're seeing today, and the general fight for racial justice that people see outside of the courtroom but maybe don't connect to public defenders? How do public defenders fit into that?
Let me talk about Cincinnati right now. I am so proud of the public defender office here. It is getting a lot better. When I first came here, not so much. Now they've got a committed group of lawyers who really are fighting hard for the community. And I think about when the pandemic started and we had a jail that was bursting at the seams with 1,200 people. It was the public defender's office, particularly the young public defenders, who led the charge to get the population reduced to 800. And that happened within a matter of days. And we still got ways to go on that, but they led that charge. And again, who are we talking about being locked up? Black and brown people. And when I think about the arrest that happened during the protest around George Floyd's murder, it was the young public defenders in our community who are stepping up and working extra hard to make sure that the folks who got arrested, black, brown, and white, are not punished for using their voices at this critical time. I could not be prouder of the public defenders in our community, and knowing that we have defenders in the Cincinnati area who really get the importance of this work. And by the way, I think many of them would agree with what James said 25 years ago about this being the civil rights work that needs to be done. I feel like we're getting that now in Cincinnati, even though we still got a ways to go in terms of getting caseloads reduced and getting them the resources that they need to do the work in an even better way. But in terms of their spirit, they're warriors. And I think when you have warriors, you can feel more confident about expressing your voices during a time of unrest, and know that you've got lawyers who are going to have your back if you get in trouble. And that's one of the roles that our local public defender has played here in Hamilton County.
John, can I ask you a question in response to your question?
Yeah.
When you say you speak that way to funders,
mm-hmm.
and so I'm assuming we're talking about kind of like people who are sympathetic to the need to resist mass incarceration, right, and reimagine our justice system. So when you present this vision of public defenders as central,
mm-hmm.
and you're saying people don't get it, what are the kinds of things that you're hearing in response? Are people saying, well, John, your vision of public defenders' offices is not how it is in most places. In a lot of places, they're overworked, underfunded, and full of people who don't really care that much about their clients, or maybe they cared once upon a time, but the structural forces have made it so that they don't care anymore. They can't afford to care. Or is it that they say, well, they're just a cog. They're a cog in the system. Like, what is it that they are saying to resist the story that we all, four of us on this call, believe so fervently?
I think that's a great question. And I don't know that there's a monolithic answer, but I think anyone who's trying to garner support in the public defender space knows that public defenders are struggling to get resources, even while other initiatives in the criminal justice arena do. There's a lot of money for progressive prosecutors and for ending cash bail and sentencing reform. I think if I had to think about what I'm hearing when I ask that question, I think I'm talking to people that respect public defenders. They love public defenders. They think public defenders are critically essential to get individuals justice, but they think that public defenders representing one person at a time, one case at a time, doesn't have the systemic impact that makes the investment worthwhile. And I think we are constantly trying to articulate why public defenders who speak for 80% of the people in the system collectively are the vehicle that infuses the system with the stories that judges, prosecutors need to hear in order to just treat people with dignity. Without public defenders, 80% of the people in the system are processed into cages as cases and case files. And I think that's hard to get across.
I'll say that as I've watched sort of the George Floyd situation happen and all the uprisings, a part of me was saying, and I'm still saying I'm so excited and so pleased, but part of me was also saying to the world, you're surprised and angry and upset now just because you haven't been listening to public defenders, right? Like what we saw happen to him, what we've seen happen to the gentleman in Georgia who was shot in the back, our clients might not have died in those situations, but those are the stories that we've been hearing for years. And when we try to bring those things up to prosecutors and judges and to sentencing advocates and things and say, this is what these people are going through, those things are sort of ignored and poo-pooed and treated as though we're making them up. And so there was almost a slight satisfaction of saying, I am so happy you all are now as uncomfortable as the rest of us have been for years. And think about what would have happened if George Floyd had not passed away, or if there had not been that video, that he would have been our client. And we would have been trying to free him and trying to get people to sit themselves in that seat and realize that that's why you can't ignore it. You can't say it could just happen to somebody else, because it could be any of us, black or brown, on the wrong day and trying to get people amped up about it. So, being a PD is on that front line and being able, I think it's right there, to tell those stories in a way to try to make America understand it's why we have to be in the conversation. The conversation about defunding the police needs to involve PDs, right? Because we know what happens with their resources. We know how they jump out on our clients. We know how they, use their money to just harass people. But I feel like even in that, they're not really highlighting that PDs can provide a lot of that information. So I've been excited, but it's almost like a big "we told you so" moment.
Amen.
That's really...
And I think one of the reasons why it's been hard to raise up the public defender voices as public defenders, because I feel like we have actually had a tremendous impact on the conversation. I feel like a lot of the change that you're seeing happening is because public defenders, both inside the courtroom and former public defenders outside the courtroom, are telling these stories. So I think that even though that we're not centered, I think that actually we are at the center, but we're just haven't been acknowledged as such. And I think one of the reasons why it's been hard to actually be acknowledged as such is that, as we all know, when you're doing cases, when you're actually representing people, you both are overwhelmed because of the amount of work that you have, and every hour that you spent doing anything outside the courtroom or outside your clients is at the cost of the work that your clients deserve, so you tend not to do it. And two, there's just ethical and other considerations with talking about your work and your cases in the broader public sphere. And so we tend then to focus our work and our advocacy in not private, because courts are public, but if you know what I mean, like nobody's actually there seeing what's going on. So we're making arguments to juries or we're making arguments to judges, but we're not making an argument to the broader public. And so as a result, I think there's a lot of lack of familiarity with the actual heroic work, right? The work that David is talking about doing, that Heather is talking about doing, right? That you all are doing every day. That work itself doesn't get visibility because of certain kind of structural and ethical features. And so then it's the obligation on us who are former public defenders to center it as much as we can. But not everybody does that, unfortunately.
I just wanted to add one more thought, and I agree with both what Heather and James just said. I think something else may be going on too, and I don't know that the funders would ever admit this, but I think that there is a desire to use resources to help people who are considered sympathetic. And when I think about the arguments around bail reform, why we need it, a lot of the narrative is that people who can't make bail wind up pleading guilty to things that they didn't do. So it's still sort of, in some ways, the innocence frame. Now, we know why bail reform matters. It's about getting people out of cages, irrespective of whether they're guilty or not, because they shouldn't be locked up just because they can't afford bail. But I think that too many people who are doing the funding and that we need to really care about these issues, deep down inside, and maybe it's at a subconscious level, write the people off that we serve. And it makes it harder for us to break through and get the support that we need.
Yeah. So David, your comment reminds me of something you said, James, when you spoke at a Gideon's Promise event in D.C., and you talked about why public defenders are so important if you care about bail reform, because a judge can't make a just decision about a human being if there's not a public defender telling them who that person is. Same with sentencing reform, right? You can do away with mandatory minimums, but a judge can't fashion a fair sentence if they don't know something about the human being. That's the public defender. Progressive prosecutor or prosecutor reform. That prosecutor can't act on those progressive instincts if they don't know the human being. And David, as you were talking, I thought about your words, James, because I think that's a lot of what Dave's getting at.
Brian Stevenson's famous quote about, none of us is the worst thing that we've ever done, right? And we don't want to treat anybody like their worst act or their worst moment, right? And we all, for a lot of us, that's part of our vision and our mission for why we do the work that we do. But we always have to ask ourselves, well, who's the person who's going to tell the rest of the story? The prosecution is there to talk about the worst thing you ever did. So if we don't want to treat people as that worst thing, that means we want to tell the rest of their life story. We want to put their life in context. We want to show the hardship. We want to show the love. We want to show the obstacles. That's who's going to do that. If the only person in the system who is possibly situated to do that is the public defender. And so in the absence of that, people are only and inevitably going to be judged as the worst thing they've ever done, because that's quite literally the only thing anybody in the system is going to know about them.
Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm sitting, and by the way, I'm sitting next to Illy. She says hello to all of you and sends her love. while she's writing me notes about how little time we have left. So I want to wrap up with one last question, because I really want to get your thoughts about this for the public defenders out there. And I talk to public defenders every day that, who toil day in and day out doing really hard work. I think, James, as you were saying, no one was watching, no cameras were on, no one even knows it's going on. But it's that transformative work that you do every day when there isn't the energy of this moment, when that energy passes. But they're looking at the sort of the energy of the moment and wondering if they're doing enough, right? They see people pushing this moment and they wonder if they're doing enough as public defenders. And so I want to wrap up with each of you just sharing your thoughts to the public defenders out there about why they are doing enough, they're doing necessary work, they're doing critical work. What do you say to that public defender who's wondering if they're doing enough? HP, let's start with you.
Sure. I would tell them that they are absolute superheroes and that what they're giving that client who often has no anyone who believes in them, anyone who will stand up for them, is the belief that they are worthy. This society has spent time, years, strategically and systematically telling Black and brown people that they are worthy of nothing. And so when you're a PD and you tell that person, I value your life, even sometimes when that client themselves doesn't see the value and only of who they are, that's a power that only public defenders have. And we do it at the odds of being, disliked and disdained by a whole huge system. But I just would remind them that they are giving a voice to the voiceless, and that at some point, while you might not see it with every client, you might do cases and that client goes on, you are touching somebody. Somebody is watching. Somebody is seeing that here is somebody who cares, even when the world is telling us that they don't. And for them, I'm thankful. I'm not an official public defender anymore. I'm not at an office, but we still take a huge amount of court-appointed cases. And that was extremely important to me when we left PDS, because I feel like I owe that, right? I was very lucky to make it and not sort of be as many of my classmates were. And so I owe that to give them my voice. And for every PD that's doing that, that is the blessing that they bestow upon the world every day.
Yeah. Thank you for that. David, what would you say to them?
First of all, to HP, you are still a public defender. Once you are a public defender, you are always one. That is something that we will always. It is always going to be part of who you are and the approach that you bring to the work. And to be 100% honest, I can't say it better than what HP said. I may use some different words, but it's not going to be better, because I also feel like the gift that we can give our clients, the human beings that we represent, is to affirm their humanity. Yeah, we want to bring about what our client's goal is. We want to win their case, or if it's a case where they want to plead guilty, and we want to make sure that they don't go to jail or prison, or that they get the best outcome possible. But we're not going to always succeed in that. But we do succeed when we remind the people that we get to represent that they are human beings, that they are cared for, that they deserve to be cared for and to be fought for. And that's a gift that we give no matter what the outcome is. And so I think that keep doing the work, if for no other reason than you get to affirm the humanity of the people that you represent.
Thank you for that, David. And James?
I agree. I agree so much. And just hearing Heather and David speak is also, to me, a reminder of how much I value this community. And I'm so glad, Rapping, that you brought us together. And I agree with exactly what both of them said in terms of affirming the humanity. And I want to say just focus on why I think that matters so much. And I think it matters to the system, and I think it matters to the individual. And here's how I think it matters to the system, especially in this moment of protest. Because here is, for all those public defenders who are wondering if they're doing enough, let me tell you that you are, and here's why. There's a lot of people right now that have woken up to some unfairnesses, as Heather said, that we've been seeing for a long time. But I want y'all to be clear as day about this for every single public defender who's listening. Right now, there's people in that courthouse that you work in. There's prosecutors, there's judges, there's bailiffs, there's marshals, there's clerks who will watch the news and be mad. They might have a Black Lives Matter poster on their lawn. They might read Do Jim Crow in book club. But when they get into court, when they get into their job on Monday, and they get that black body in front of them who's ready to be processed and who they've always processed, they will rest assured continue to process that body and grind up those bodies without any thought or any reference to what's happening in the outside world, unless the public defenders stand up and stand strong and stand tall and slow that system down and say, no, not today. No, Your Honor, no, I'm not done. There's some things that you need to know. I'm not finished. That person must be there to make the system be anything like the aspiration of the streets. And that's the public defender. And the second reason why it matters is to the person. I don't represent people in court anymore, but I teach in prison. I teach every semester in prison, in a men's prison in the fall, women's prison in the spring. And as part of that, I get to work with people who have had lawyers. Last semester, I had a man that I taught in my class, and we were taught, it was the week of public defenders. We have a week devoted to public defenders in our class. And there was a lot of, criticism from different people, but he stood up and he talked about his case and how he was vilified by the press. He was vilified by the prosecutor, and there were some people in his own family who turned against him. And the one person who actually spoke his name and spoke his story and spoke his truth was his public defender. And he didn't win. They lost. He's incarcerated now. But what he told me and what he told the whole class is that his public defender's account of him is what made him remember actually who he really was, because he was at risk of starting to believe he was the nothing that the system was describing him as. And that image that his public defender told, his true story, keeps him going now every day and allows him to not lose sight of his humanity. So it's so important. Don't stop. Don't stop. We need you.
Yeah, wow. I have so much love for you all. I mean, I can't tell you how really giddy I am to be on a call with you right now, and the fact that it's Juneteenth just makes it that much more special. I want to wrap up by just going back to something you said, Heather, about George Floyd, and if George Floyd hadn't been killed, in fact, for every George Floyd killed, tens of thousands of people aren't killed. They're processed through the criminal justice system, and I think it's so important that we connect the violence happening to people in the streets with the violence happening to Black and brown people in courtrooms every day when the lights are out, when it's in the invisible violence, the accepted violence. And really, public defenders are the only weapon that communities have in those arenas to interrupt that routine violence. And so I just appreciate you all amplifying that message. The last thing I want to say before I wrap up, as I said, I'm sitting next to Illy. She's not a lawyer. We all have dear friends who are not lawyers, who are as much public defenders as people with law degrees. And so I want to be clear, when we're talking about public defenders, we're talking about those mitigation specialists and social workers and investigators and administrative specialists, support staff, everybody who works to interrupt that routine violence. We have nothing but love for you. And so I just want to end by saying that. And finally, as I mentioned during the first episode, I stole my closing line from my daughter, who 6 years ago would close out the morning announcements at her elementary school with "This is Aaliyah wrapping it up." And I can't do any better than that. So I'm going to end by saying this is Jonathan Rapping, host of Gideon's Promise, the podcast, wrapping it up.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.